Yeah, hello, thank you. So I'm going to quickly talk about the publishing that we do at Arcadia Missa and then try and make some claims which are completely just my own opinion. This is an example of the last e-journal we did. We have a journal called How to Sleep Faster, and we've just, in the summer, published the 6th issue. And most of the all the publications we do eventually get turned into e-publications, but we, for a while, and maybe we'll do it again, but I don't know when, we're experimenting with the idea of an e-publication that wasn't mimicking the idea of turning a page. So the first one we did in like 2011, we thought we were really clever. We worked out that we could embed videos into PDFs. And so it was just basically like one big map. And so it was the idea of curating a digital space whereby the artwork, the videos, and the text would all be part of one thing that you could move around. And then the second one, we actually just did in Pages and inserted into an MOV file that was just almost like an infinite loop. And again, with that, it felt like you were moving around, but you were actually just kind of moving slides, but it felt like you were actually moving around into different areas. And then we eventually, for this last one, settled on just standard website. And again, it's this idea of how to have video and text in a digital publication that doesn't have the same kind of uniformity or context, something like YouTube or Vimeo, because we work with a lot of younger artists, and it's kind of expected that you're going to put your work online, and when that happens, there is actually a framing that isn't necessarily conducive to the work or the choice of the artist. So that was kind of the idea behind these e-publications, but what we found is actually the print publications were better, basically. So that's an example of the print publication. And I'm just going to say quickly why I think that print has prevailed for us. I think it'd be interesting to hear the next speaker, because I guess your audience is so much bigger than ours, but because our audience is so small, it was actually the print publications which became something that was more successful in that, you know, it came to define more what we were about, it built a sense of community, and it kind of like really started to identify a place of assembly. And what was also interesting for the artists is just kind of saying, right, this is the space, here is the space of the book. Having something that isn't an exhibition that gets taken down and is something that is fixed was exciting for artists, but also exciting for us because it meant that we get to work with more people. And so I think technology has contributed to, so here's just some screenshots from the last publication. So technology's obviously contributed to the fact that our printed publications have prevailed over the digital ones. Technology's contributed to it by the fact that we design it all ourselves with free labor. We use print-on-demand publishing so that we're not having to spend a huge amount of printing costs, and we can just get between 1 or 500 copies done at a time and see how it goes. So it's kind of like practically viable. I think that also, though, the reason why the print publications proved more popular for our audience was that at the same time there is kind of almost a resurgence of zine culture. So aside from the fact that these books or objects, they locate and identify the community around the gallery and the dialogues that are happening, both like in the space but also, you know, online with a network of people. Again, it's, you know, it's not like it's open access. I think we need to remember that. But yeah, the books are practically more helpful in terms of surviving without funding, but yeah, they do have this link to zine culture, which has kind of come out of Tumblr, I guess. So these are some things that I just ripped off Tumblr, and yeah, so that image there is actually just a documentary you can watch on Netflix about Kathleen Hanna. And what was happening at the same time as our print publications were getting more popular is actually there were kind of communities on Tumblr that were that were growing and that were taking from previous generations. And so a lot of these Tumblrs, like one for example, called Queer Libido, was something that I followed a few years ago, and it gave me so much more than any academic texts were giving me. And what happens in these platforms is that there is a kind of immediate and often personal form of publishing, and it's different to traditional publishing models. And this is a kind of the same sentiment that exists in the book that we publish, because we're able to just design them ourselves and print them very quickly. So it's not that surprising that the personal voice and scene cultures have this kind of strong presence in Tumblr. So kind of, I guess, just to make a few links, so where cyberfeminism was intertwined with the rise of the internet, and zine culture was bound with an increased access to cheap photocopying, and feminist video art rose often outside of the institution as access to video cameras became easier. It's not surprising that Web 2.0 offers an instant and encouraged space for the personal and the rebloggable, and thus has picked up from previous trends and movements. And I think the reblog format is definitely something that encourages this. And so, yeah, so here are a few of the kind of zines that are going on right now or in the last few years that have definitely been inspired by these kind of communities on Tumblr. One of the big things that kept coming up was also like this, you know, Sylvia Plath quotes being reblogged over and over again, as well as Riot Girl images. And so, yeah, I don't think it's that surprising that our print publications were more successful. Like, yeah, I should say that we do them all in black and white because we can't afford colour printing and stuff. So there's already an aesthetic that's constrained by, you know, practical necessity that references this, whether we want to or not. So, yeah, artist novellas. So we've done 5 artist novellas. And, yeah, the format is just kind of give the novella, so a rough amount of words and the same size. It's about, I don't know, like 16 by 20 centimeters or something, and just kind of give an individual or a duo artist or writers the opportunity to make a novella, whatever that may be, for the artists that take it on. And I think that it was quite natural for us to do that because this attitude of the personal being accepted as publishable, I think is why that there's been a lot more slippage actually between art and literature. Again, this is just in my own personal experience. So yeah, doing a novella series was extremely natural. And yeah, so these are the 5 we've done. The people we've done them by are up there. And then we also have 2 more coming out next February, one by Sarah M. Harrison and one by Linda Stupart. And then we have another book that we're doing in partnership with an American publisher called Dominica Publishers, which is run by Martine Sims, and that will be a collection of Hannah Black's writings. So I'm going to try and explain what I mean about this slippage between art and writing that's happened more, or why artists are more poets and artists now, or whatever. So, yeah. So the kind of way that we live, or the way that we use social media, or that we use junk time, which is a term that Hito Style has developed, and I'll just quickly note that how she just kind of describes the term, which is that duration cannot be sustained because people are exhausted. They cannot afford it anymore. They don't have time. The time they have has to be artificially boosted or extended. You have to pretend you're basically present on one online channel whilst you try and catch some sleep, but all the tab browsers are open at the same time. And so, yeah, I think this kind of notion of always publishing yourself, always being present, and that form of presencing being mediated and actually kind of propagated by social media does have something to do with the way that language is maybe changing, or the way that artists are using language. So to go back to one of the artist novellas we did, that's an excerpt right from the start of Holly Childs's. And this, Astrid Lorange, in the preface to the book, described Danklands as an anarcho-cartography, a series of fragments and half-dialogues, unsynthesized and multiply networked. It is an index of labour, ambient, expansive, affective, that converges in and as a book. If it's a record of the labour of writing, then it's also a record of the material that writing's labour transforms. Conversations and social encounters, intimacies, public spaces, snacks, video streams, jet lag, weather formations, hair dye, soft docs, latex. So, end quotes. So not only does Holly's writing take the fragmented form of the immediate self-publishing and reflection, it also mixes in references and languages which are inherent to a mode of communication, which is digital and coded within certain communities online. And I would say what's particularly interesting for me about Danklens is that it both responds to alt-lit, which I guess, I don't know, Harry, you could correct me, but I guess some of the people that Harry mentioned you would call alt-lit. So it kind of responds to alt-lit, but it also picks up a sort of surrealist form of literature in that it continues an intense subjectivity of the self-imagination that embodies blurred forms, perspectives, times and places, which is something that hasn't been that prevalent for a while. So, and I think this is really interesting if we think about surrealism, because where surrealist writers such as Breton and, forgive me, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Tristan Tzara, they were actually the ones that were inspiring surrealist painters. And so after this moment, in some ways, art developed quicker than literature. So although there has been a line of avant-garde literature like Louis Aragon and more recently Bret Easton Ellis and Tao Lin, this kind of specific surrealist psychological exploration has developed at a much, much slower pace, as I would argue that postmodern or avant-garde or minimalist literature, or whatever I should be calling it, I don't know because I know nothing about literature, I'm sorry. But literature has developed at a much slower pace because, to put it quite basically, literature moves slower than art or music, and I reckon it's because it just takes longer to consume, takes longer to read a book, you know. So I think that the influence of the publishing of the self, both online and in independent publishing, and the increased bleed between art and literature has shaken the definitions of art and literature, and possibly it's also shaken the stagnation of both art and literature. So maybe I've missed some slides. No, so I just wanted to put this up because, I mean, obviously we are co-publishing a book with Hannah Black, so it is a bit promotion, but Hannah Black is actually, in my opinion, the best artist-writer of my generation who uses the first person and uses the first person well. And so I'm kind of almost finished, and I know in your introduction you were saying that kind of this third series is much more about a kind of positive take on kind of what happens, but I'm afraid that my ending is a bit negative. So I want to end on some negative points, and I'm just going to list them. And I think it's also funny because one of my negative points is interesting in terms of what Katja said, because, you know, you referenced a platform where people actually do make money out of it, but you'll see what I mean. So, yeah, so the list. So the first negative point is that the idea of another voice, a voice that does not replicate the language of white capitalist patriarchy, while I've witnessed online, what have I witnessed? While I've witnessed online that spaces do provide the space for this other voice, we must also be mindful that an other voice, whilst giving space for the individual, should also be open to the fact that the individual voice is one of pluralities. So obviously people like Sisu have talked about this before. And what I would say is that we need to let the voice, the subjective, this kind of like trend in first person or a kind of slightly different form of literature that bleeds into art, let it not just be a style. And so secondly, we can't forget that there are degrees of access to these spaces, and there is also the question of whom is deemed a subject. So there's many forms of privilege which still affect who does or does not feel permitted to speak. I'm on this panel, yet I'm not an expert, and I'm only speaking from my opinion. Actually, many people are not given that space. So yes, the subjective is important, but not the individual, in the sense of whose experiences may be flattened or shadowed in the process, creating just another dominant monoculture. So as a side note of how this might operate, how the kind of the idea of the voice, the subjective voice, might transform into actually just another form of like hegemony and individualism is an example would be the Red Femme Conference in London, where trans women were banned. So, you know, this is something that we need to be extremely wary of. And actually, yeah, that's it. So the third negative point is that as we self-publish online, and this is where Katja, your thing was really interesting for me. As we self-publish online, we are performing free labor for corporations who profit from this, a third-party financialization of the self, of ourselves. I would say that the subjective turn provides cognitive and communicative capitalism in a similar way that reproductive and affective labor creates value for capital. And then my last slide. So lastly, in regard to the necessary suspicion of how these platforms and neoliberal ideologies can co-opt lives, stories, voices, or for want of a better word, the individual, I wanted to end on this quote that's up there, and it's from Jackie Wang's text, Against Innocence. I'm not going to read the quote, but I recommend that everyone read the text because it's the best text that I've read in quite a while. It's really brilliant. It prompted me to consider so much, but it also allowed me to be able to identify where I'm at in terms of how the first person or the subjective exists in culture. And that is that I feel the pertinent question now is how can we occupy these spaces, how can we find or retain autonomy, and how can this be collective without our own otherness, our own specific experiences, reenacting patterns of power that simply other someone else instead. So that's it. Much shorter. Thank you. Videos into PDFs, and so it was just basically like one big map. And so it was the idea of curating a digital space whereby the artwork, the videos, and the text would all be part of one thing that you could move around. And then the second one, we actually just did in Pages and inserted into an MOV file that was just almost like an infinite loop. And again, with that, it felt like you were moving around, but you were actually just kind of moving / the sixth issue. And most of all the publications we do eventually get turned into e-publications, but we, for a while, and maybe we'll do it again, but I don't know when, we're experimenting with the idea of an e-publication that wasn't mimicking the idea of turning a page. So the first one we did in like 2011, we thought we were really clever. We worked out that we could embed, there is actually a framing that isn't necessarily conducive to the work or the choice of the artist. So that was kind of the idea behind these e-publications, but what we found is actually the print publications were better, basically. So that's an example of the print publication. And I'm just going to say quickly why I think that print has prevailed for us, but it felt like you were actually moving around into different areas. And then we eventually, for this last one, settled on just standard website. And again, it's this idea of how to have video and text in a digital publication that doesn't have the same kind of uniformity or context, something like YouTube or Vimeo, because we work with a lot of younger artists, and it's kind of expected that you're going to put your work online, and when that happens, hello, thank you. So I'm going to quickly talk about the publishing that we do at Arcadia Missa, and then try and make some claims which are completely just my own opinion. This is an example of the last e-journal we did. We have a journal called How to Sleep Faster, and we've just, in the summer, published